was on top of Mount Washington for a meeting. And after the meeting, I got into my car and I do what I always do because I'm directionally challenged, all right? Ask my wife, all right? I could be someplace like 10 times and still not know how to get there and get back, all right? I'm just directionally challenged. So I do what I always do. I pulled up my Waze app. All right, and for those of you who do not know what the Waze app is, here it is. It's an interactive navigational system created for me, right? Because I'm directionally challenged. And so it shows you a real-time map on your screen, and it follows you, and it shows you exactly when to turn and where to turn. Like a voice comes on, like you watch the map and a voice tells you when to turn and where to turn. So I love this. I can speak into the air. I love technology. I can speak into the air. Okay, Waze, go home. And she figures out the best way for me from Mount Washington to go home. So here I am on Mount Washington, and I am just driving along, and the lady's voice tells me to make a right. So I begin to make a right. The problem was at this particular intersection in Pittsburgh, there were 2 rights, only in Pittsburgh, right? So I glanced at the map and I was like, oh, I got nervous and I accidentally made the wrong right. And I start heading down the hill and it begins to get very narrow, Mount Washington roads, right? And I see on the road, it says now, dead end. I'm like, great. So here's what's happened. I'm driving down this hill the wrong direction, and on my right is a guardrail with a cliff, and on my left is now like a hill with like houses built into the hill, only in Pittsburgh, right? Okay, and so I get to the dead end, and there before me is a driveway, has cars in it. So there's the house, the driveway, on my right is a cliff, on my left is, a hill. So literally, I am stuck on Mount Washington because when I went to turn around in the driveway, you know what I saw? A sign that says, this is not a turnaround. So here I am, Mount Washington, I'm stuck. And I wonder if this is how many of us feel when it comes to our relationships. Think about your relationship with God. Maybe some of you feel like it took a wrong turn a while back. Think about marriage. For some of you, you know that your marriage is headed downhill in the wrong direction. For some of you, your relationship with your parents, it feels like it's just one conversation away from heading over the cliff, right? For some of us with our boss or with our coworkers, it feels like, man, we've reached a dead end at this job and we don't know how to get turned around. For those of us who are dating in the room, that swipe right turned out to be the wrong Mr. Right. So that's why we're doing this series, because we know that many of us, we feel stuck in our relationships. As a church, we just finished up a series last 3 weeks on breakthrough, and we know that this is an area where many of us, we need God to break through in our relationships. We just need help to get turned around and headed in the right direction. And so the starting point of this series today for 4 weeks is to help you realize that you're just like me. You're directionally challenged. Like all of us are directionally challenged when it comes to navigating our relationships. And the point of this series is to help us realize that the God who created you, in all of your complexities, in all of the weirdness of your emotions that you experience, is the same God who created that person that you're having trouble navigating relationship with. He created them and their brains and their emotions. He's the same God who created the complexities of every human body on the planet. He's the same God who created the complexities of the galaxies and all of the inhabitants within it. He's the same God who's given each and every one of us ways to navigate relationships. Not only with him, but also with each other. And so here's what I know. When we get to the end of this 4-week series, there's going to be 2 types of people in the room. Jesus, when he taught his ways, He said there's going to be two types of people at the end. He put it like this: therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine, these ways of mine, and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house, his relationship, on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against that house or relationship, yet it did not fall. Why? Because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these ways of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his relationship on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against that house, that relationship, and it fell with a great crash. See, here's what I love about God. He loves us so much that he's already provided us with the solution, with the way for us to follow. All we have to do now is follow the map. And we got to listen for his voice and follow his ways. But this is where you and I get into trouble, right? Because there are some of us here today that we don't realize that God actually has ways. And it's not our fault. We just maybe didn't grow up that way. And so maybe you're here today to try to discover that kind of stuff. There are some of you that are here today. You think that God doesn't even care about you, let alone your relationships. There are some of us who are here today, let's be honest, we know God's ways. We just choose to do it our way, not his. And in all of those scenarios, then we're left to figure it out by ourselves, right? Based off of maybe our feelings, based off of what our friend says or what our professor taught us. You know, maybe based off of the latest trends that we see on social media or in the news, and we're left to figure it out for ourselves. We have to figure out what is right. But there's a problem with that. And God, because he loves us so much, he points it out for our benefit. Here's what he says: there's a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death. He says our way leads to a dead end, spiritually, emotionally, physically, relationally. See, Jesus clearly laid out for us that there's going to be two types of people at the end of this series: those who are wise, who are going to listen and actually do it his way, and those who are foolish, who are going to listen, but then they're going to choose their own way anyway. So I want you to think about that person right now that you're having trouble relating to. Maybe it's your spouse, it's your boss, your friend, coworker, whoever that is. Get that person in your mind, those people. And I want you to think about what Jesus just said. Think about that relationship and what Jesus just said, and then apply it to that relationship. See, if you want a thriving relationship, then build it God's way. If you want a dying relationship, then build it your way. Because we're all directionally challenged. And the point of this series is that we would all become wise to God's ways of doing relationships. And so we're going to do that together over the next 4 weeks, taking a look at what God spoke through a man by the name of Paul, the Apostle Paul, and what he penned in Romans 12. Okay, so I want you to get there in your Bible. We're going to do this, spend this entire series in Romans 12. And so I want to give you some context, some background for why Paul wrote what he wrote in Romans 12, because it might not make sense to us without the background. So forgive me this morning. I am going to do a complete oversimplification of Paul's eloquent theology found in Romans 1 through 11. It's brilliant. And I'm going to boil it all down to one sentence. Here it is. Romans 1 through 11 is all about God making a way for mankind to be reconciled back to him. That's Romans 1 through 11. Let me expound a little bit. God created mankind, you and me, to be in a right relationship with him, a peaceful relationship with him. But we, humankind, we severed that relationship by choosing our own way. It's what Paul says here, for all of us have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So that resulted in our relationship with God coming to a dead end. And that's why Paul writes this: the wages of sin is death, physically, spiritually, for eternity. But God wouldn't have it that way. So look at what Paul writes. So God demonstrated his love toward us, that while we were still sinners, while we're still at that dead end, Christ died for us. See, God made a way through the death and the resurrection of his son, Jesus Christ, for all of us to therefore be reconciled, have the opportunity to have a right relationship with God again. And he writes this, that if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is your leader, your Lord, and believe in your heart, what he's talking about there is you're living from that belief and trusting him. It's my passion, I'm going after him with all of my heart, that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. That you'll be put back into that right relationship with God again when you die to your way and do it his way. See, Paul's basically saying, Romans 1 through 11, if you know that Jesus, then you can have a relationship with God. But he's also saying, if you don't know that Jesus, then you cannot have a relationship with God, and you're headed towards death. So, Romans 1 through 11, there it was. Then Paul takes a turn in the letter, and he writes Romans 12, therefore. So I went, what is Romans 1 through 11 therefore? Right here, he's saying, I urge you now, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer yourselves, your bodies, as a living sacrifice, to die while you're still living. What does that mean? Holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. This is the purpose of your life, he's saying. So he said, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed. How? By the renewing of your mind. And if you do that, then you'll be able to test and approve what God's ways are, what God's will is. His good, his pleasing, and his perfect will. He said, if you want to know God's ways of doing relationships, don't do it the way that the world tells us how to do it. Don't do it the culture's way to do it. We should train our minds to think as God thinks, to see as he sees. How do we do that? We've got to renew our minds with God's ways. So let's dig into that. Because from this point forward, in Romans 12 and on, Paul's telling us how we can do relationships. So Romans 12 through 16, God has ways for us to best relate to each other and now participate in reconciling each other back to God. Now that you and I have been reconciled to God in relationship, we get to participate in what Paul calls the ministry of reconciliation. He says we're not going to do relationships the way that the world does relationships. We're going to do it God's ways. So the first two verses of Romans 12 that Paul writes here, it's his plea. I want you to, it's like he's on his knees begging us, please get this, he's saying, for us to recognize that our way is not working and we need to follow God's ways. Our ways lead to that dead end. And he's helping us get turned around. When we die to ourselves, to our way, we die to the way that we think. And now we're thinking like God. But how do we renew our minds with God's ways? What does that look like? Well, he's saying, I've already given you a map. And you need to renew your mind with my ways. And you need to actually discover, read about what are my ways, and then listen to my real-time voice as to how you're supposed to apply those ways. And that takes time. That takes practice to be able to do that. And so we're going to learn how to do that. So when I was 17 years old, I had just graduated from high school, and it was before I went to college. That summer, I gave my life to Jesus. And I could feel something different in me. I don't fully know how to explain it. I just knew that there was something different about me when I gave my life to Christ. And I could tell that God was changing me from the inside out, but that didn't mean that everything changed and was fixed like that, especially in the area of my relationships, because I had messed up and done some things I'm not proud of. So when I got to college, I met a professor who challenged me to read the Bible for myself and to meet with him on a weekly basis to talk about what it is that I was learning from what I was reading in the scriptures. I didn't know it then, but he was actually discipling me in the ways of God, right? And so here's the thing about me. I grew up in the church my whole life. My parents took me to church. I knew the Bible stories because there was people up there always talking to me about those Bible stories. I knew them, I heard them, right? But I had never read the Bible for myself. So when I began to read the Bible for myself, I could feel something changing in me. My mind started to change. You can ask my sister. I mean, my relationship with my sister in middle school and high school was brutal. We fought all the time. We hated each other. Ask my parents. We fought all the time. But as I began to read the scriptures, you know what I discovered? I needed to go back to her. And I needed to apologize for some things. She also did the same. And we reconciled my freshman year, and we've moved forward ever since. You can ask my dad. Freshman year for me was a huge transformation in my life. I was changing. He could see it because he and I in high school, we went at it head to head, man. Brutal fights between him and me. That freshman year, I read some stuff in the scriptures and I discovered that's not the way that I should treat my dad. So I needed to go back and apologize. And we had a really honest, tough conversation where I cried, I repented, I asked for his forgiveness. He did the same, and we've been moving forward ever since. You can ask my wife. Freshman year was a year of transformation for me. You wanna know why? Because the girls who were on her freshman floor that I went to high school with, they told Erica to stay away from me. Like I was bad news. I was not nice to the ladies in high school. And so they said, steer clear of Kent. But as I dug into the scriptures, I learned some things and I started thinking differently about dating relationships and purity and how I should treat and view women. And I'm proud to say that Erica and I then dated for 4 years, married 2 weeks after college, and we've been married for 20 years. Right? So, see, here's the thing. For 25 years now, God's continued to take me to school in the process of transformation. I'm not done yet. Are you? No, none of us are. And he's been schooling me that if I actually do his ways that he reveals in the scriptures, he'll continue to transform me from the inside out. And so this word that Paul uses here, when he gets into verse 2, he says this, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world. That's what I was doing for all of those 17 years. That's what I was doing. And if Paul was here to say, maybe in our language today, he might say something like this, don't let the culture around you squeeze you into its mold. All right, get this picture. If he were here today, he might say something like this. Don't let today's Tinder culture convince you that that's the only way to do dating relationships. You know, he might say something like this. Don't let today's parent bleacher coaching culture squeeze you into thinking that that's how you're supposed to relate to your kids. He might say something like this. Don't let today's tweet whatever you feel, hide whatever I snap, social media culture squeeze you into believing that a screen is a real friendship and a real relationship and a proper platform for us to discuss difficult and complex conversations. Don't be squeezed into that kind of a mold because you're different now. Now that you've been reconciled to me, you do relationships differently now. And he continues, verse 2, but Be transformed by the renewing of your minds. How? He's talking about disciplining ourselves, to learn God's ways, to study them, and letting God remold our minds from within. So we're to study God's ways on how to relate to authority. We're to study God's ways on how to relate to our spouse. Study God's ways on how to relate to your family members and your coworkers and your boss and your neighbors. Study them, memorize them, rehearse them, do them. And then, he continues, then you'll be able to test and approve what God's ways are. His will is his good, pleasing, and perfect will. His perfect ways. As you and I renew our minds with God's ways, as we study them, the good and the perfect and the pleasing way, we'll learn how to navigate our relationships. But here's the thing, there are many of us who already know these ways. We just don't do them. And I'm in the same boat. I do the things that I shouldn't do. And I don't do the things that I know that I should do. Anybody else with me on that? And I feel powerless at times to be able to do God's ways. But the Holy Spirit within us is the transformation inside of us that will actually empower us to not only know them, He helps us be able to do them. So we're not hopeless today. We have the hope of the Holy Spirit to help us to do and pull off God's ways. So don't these words of good, perfect, and pleasing sound so much better than these words? Downhill, dead end, no turnaround, stuck. See, if we know and we practice, experiment with God's ways, He begins to transform us. Not only us, but the relationships around us. So let's talk about butterflies. No, I'm not talking about the feeling that Erica got in her belly when she saw me for the first time on campus. Hey, oh, that was a good one. I'm talking about real butterflies. You know, let's take the monarch butterfly. Isn't this beautiful? Take a look at this picture. Beautiful. See, you do know that this beautiful butterfly started out at this guy. Now, I'm not a scientist, so don't quote me on this, but caterpillars are gross. I mean, it's straight up nasty, right? And did you know this, that the caterpillar, wherever it goes, it leaves like this slimy, nasty goo behind it wherever it goes, kind of like a junior high boy. Anyway. But inevitably, the monarch caterpillar, we know this, goes through a process of transformation and turns into this beautiful monarch butterfly. It's the process that scientists call metamorphosis, right? 6th grade science. Metamorphosis. So here's the dictionary definition, right? For insects, for amphibians, metamorphosis, listen to these words, is the process of transformation from an immature form to an adult form in distinct stages. Why do I bring this up? Because the original Greek word that Paul is writing here when he talks about in Romans 12 is the same exact word that we use as metamorphosis. He writes metamorpho in the original Greek. So the image that Paul is describing here is the shedding of an old nature and a forming and morphing into a new nature. Right? Get this picture, everybody. Shedding an old way of thinking and morphing into a new way of thinking. About God, about life, about relationships, about everything. It's a new way of thinking. And if that's not good enough, when I discovered this, oh my goodness, this was fun. You got to check this out. Did you know that when the monarch caterpillar hangs upside down and begins the process of metamorphosis, did you know this? That his head literally splits wide open. I kid you not. If you don't believe me, YouTube it. In fact, I knew that many of you wouldn't believe me, so I put it on all of my social media pages so you could see the video. All right, so seriously, take a look at this. In the process of metamorphosis, the caterpillar's head, and out of its head comes the chrysalis, the cocoon. And the cocoon comes down over the caterpillar's body, eventually shedding the caterpillar's body, and it then discards the old and the nasty and the gooey and the messy part of the caterpillar, then to turn into the beautiful monarch butterfly. Is that not an amazing image that Paul gives to us about this word, right? We're all getting excited about metamorphosis this morning, yeah. See, Paul's saying in Romans 12, and that's what we're gonna dig into this entire series. This is really an introduction sermon to 3 more weeks. What he's saying is when you and I purposefully submit ourselves to the process of metamorphosis, the process of transformation, when it comes to our relationships, that God will transform our way of thinking, that he'll split our heads open with breakthrough of new ways of thinking about how to do our relationships, his good, pleasing, and perfect way. So the question that I have for you as I leave you today is this. Do you want caterpillar relationships or butterfly relationships? Because the choice is really yours. Right? See, if you want to have continually leaving a nasty trail of relationships and pain and hurt behind you, then do it your way. But if you want to have free, light, beautiful relationships, then do it God's way. So I obviously got down from Mount Washington, right? But it took some work. Like, it was hilarious. I wish I had a video of me, because in my car, I wanted to honor the sign, don't turn around. And so you should have seen me. It was like, like a 15-point turnaround. It's hilarious. Anyway, but it took me some work, took me some time to get turned around. See, this doesn't happen just like this. We got to do some work to get turned around in the right direction. God's provided the way. How do we get back there? So I want to give you some work to do. Let's get really practical. Let's get very tangible. What should I do with this message today? How does it apply to me? So 4 things that I want to invite you into today. All right, the first one is this. On the way out, maybe you got it on the way in, I want you to pick up one of these Waze avatar stickers. This is just a fun thing that we wanted to do to help us all realize throughout this series that God has ways for us to navigate relationships. So maybe you want to put it someplace fun, in the place that you need help for God to do whatever he needs to do in your relationships. Maybe for some of you, you need to put this in your car because you really stink when the person cuts you off. And before you give them their number 1 with the wrong finger, you need to look at this sticker, right? So put it up in your visor, have it stare at you. God has ways, right? So that's fun. It's just a great reminder, right? Renew our thinking on these things. The second thing that I want to invite you to do, and of course I'm going to say this, I want to invite you to come back next week, right? Don't miss a part of this series. And I don't say that so attendance can be built. No, straight up. We're going to talk next week about how do we relate to people who are very different than us. People who have different views politically, how to raise kids, right? We're going to talk about how do we relate to people who have different cultures, upbringings than us. So we're going to ask the question, God, do you have ways for us to work with people, to relate to people who are very different than me? That's what next week is going to be all about. So come back. The third thing, and so this is going to get a little bit deeper here. Some of you know that as a church, we have an incredible ministry called LAMP, the Learning and Mentoring Partnership with the inner city schools, and it's expanding. It's beautiful. For the last 14 years, we've been doing this. And I want to invite you to become a LAMP mentor. Now, what's a mentor? Just like my college professor, helping a kid navigate life, meeting with them, grabbing coffee with them, taking them to games, whatever it might be. Come alongside of them and help them find the way. There are some of you that you had an adult figure in your life who helped you do that, and you're grateful for them. That's incredible. Good for you. Some of us in the room, we didn't have that person, but we wish we had them. So either way, we can do that for some kid. So I want to invite you to become a mentor to show some kid the way. Think about it. Bobby's going to tell you more about that in just a little bit. The last thing that I want to invite you into, well, I'm going to say it this way. I want to challenge you. I triple dog dare you on this one. I'm going to do what my professor did to me. I challenge you to read the Bible for yourself. So on your outline, I put God's ways for relationships found in Romans 12. Now, I want you to read all of Romans 12 this week. That's my challenge to you. But don't just read it. That's the easy part. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to read it line by line with this in mind, and I want you to think about that person that you're in relationship with, that you're having trouble relating to, and I want you to read this line by line, and here's how we read the Bible, okay? So God, I see here, let's pick Romans 12:10. I see that I'm supposed to honor in my relationships. So am I honoring that person, my spouse, my boss, my parents? Am I honoring that person on social media? And then wait to see what you hear. Right? You might feel an impression of, no, you're not honoring them. It'll be gentle, never slams you. That's not God's style. You might even think in your mind's eye of a time that you did not honor that person. He might bring it to your attention. And then say to God, right, line by line in each of these, okay, God, what do you want me to do about that? Wait and see what he says. And when he speaks to you, it might not be an audible voice. I've never heard an audible voice, but in my knower, I know what I'm supposed to do. Right? And God might lead you, just like he did me, to go back and apologize. He might lead you to reconcile that relationship. Who knows what God might lead you to? But here's what I would challenge you, triple dog dare you. Try it. That's it. Romans 12. Try it and see what happens. Because if this is true and we actually practice God's ways, my guess is this week, a lot of our relationships could go to another level, a step forward. Feel me? All right, let me pray for us. So God, thank you for this morning. Man, I'm so grateful for each and every person who's here. And I pray this week, God, that you would give us the courage to actually experiment and try this out. Like if we actually do what you tell us to do, we're confident that you could change our relationships. So God, I pray over each and every person here right now that you would give us confidence in your promises. God, help us to step out this week and to try it. We love you. Amen. I love y'all.